Our guest tonight, Neil Bascomb, has written 9 books. He is a national award-winning and New York Times best-selling author. All kinds of different stories of achievement and adventure. And I'm really glad he was willing to do this, coming on the heels of, not only glad he was willing to do this, but on the heels of Memorial Day, because as you know, when obviously the major reason for Memorial Day is to honor the fallen soldiers and sailors, but also one of the byproducts of it is it's a big race weekend. So if you're a big fan of the Indy 500, if you're a fan of NASCAR, Memorial Day is a big weekend for you. So on the heels of that, Neil has agreed to join us. It kind of keeps in the setting of the weekend. So would you welcome our guest tonight, Neil Bascomb?
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that introduction, and hello everyone in your living rooms. As Mark introduced, I've written a range of different books. I've written about everything from skyscraper wars in New York in the 20s to hunting Nazis in Argentina, a story of Adolf Eichmann, to most recently, of course, Faster, this story of Rene Dreyfus, a Grand Prix race car driver, Lucy Schell, who was an American heiress who helped fund his team, and their sort of battle against the Nazis right before the start of World War II. And I'll just, give me a second to share my screen here, and I'll get up a slide show that will help sort of walk everyone through our conversation this evening. Okay. All right, so with this range of different books, they are all stories about extraordinary people, ordinary people really doing extraordinary things. But I always ask myself basically 2 questions before I launch into a project. First is, do I have something new to say in this story? And this story of this, really a David and Goliath story about Rene and race cars and Grand Prix driving in pre-World War II Europe is pretty unfurrowed ground, I have to say. There was almost a dearth of books about it. There were, though, however, the German archives were very extensive. And then you find populated throughout Europe and even in the United States, all these independent collections owned by individuals who have a passion for racing. And so they would have photograph albums of Rene Dreyfus, or another person would be a sort of historian about Lucy Schell, or the Delahaye Car Company who built their Grand Prix car. And so I was able to sort of collect all those things together in a way that I was pretty sure that I would be able to tell a new story that people didn't know about in a new way. The second question I asked myself is, do I have something important to say in this story? And I'll be honest and say that as Mark's introduction, this being a big racing weekend, I was never really a motorsport fan. This story sort of first fascinated me because of the critical time in Europe. But really at the heart of it, it's a story about resistance. It's a story about Rene and Lucy standing up against the aggression of the Nazis, of in many ways kind of piercing their seeming invincibility. And it's really a story about symbols and how symbols matter, and about how their fight against the Nazis in this arena of race car driving was an important symbol in the fight ultimately against the Nazis. And so I came to this story first through a friend of mine, actually in New York. I was in New York visiting my friend Sam, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter and editor. And he passed me this press release that he was sent, as many reporters are sent press releases, about this brand new car, or not a new car, but this restored race car called the Delahaye 145. And it had this very intriguing backstory in this release about how this car, when the Germans invaded Paris, as you see here in this image, Hitler sent men to have this Delahaye 145 car found, the 4 Delahaye 145s that were ever built, and have them destroyed. He also sent men to the Automobile Club of France in Paris and had all the files and all the records removed and destroyed. And so he ultimately was unsuccessful in finding the cars because the Delahaye company and Lucy had them hidden away before the Germans invaded. But I was sort of fascinated about what it was about this car and what it was about Rene Dreyfus and the pursuit of him as well that was so important to the Nazis. What could he have done, and why was it important that it became this remarkable story of resistance? And so that was my introduction into the story of Faster. Now, I'll start first with Rene, who, and I'll just quote here because I love this description, that a journalist wrote, his contemporaneous journalist at the time wrote of Rene. And if you look into Rene's eyes as I say this, I think you'll get it. Rene had a stare of searing intensity and undying affection that lets you know without a doubt that he was put on this earth to drive cars fast. Now, Rene was French. He was born in Nice. His father was Jewish. His mother was Catholic. But really the only religion that Rene had was racing and going fast. Everything from being a young kid in a sort of toy car, sort of zooming down the hills of Nice to the seashore, to commanding his father's car and getting in there and racing it around the hills, to racing motorcycles, and ultimately to racing cars. And Rene really made his name at the 1930 Monaco Grand Prix, which was the second ever run Monaco Grand Prix. And he won it in this sort of surprise to everybody. He wasn't a professional race car driver, but he was a very risky driver, a very precise driver. And he had this ingenious technique in this race of putting in his spare seat a extra tank of gasoline, which kept them from needing to refuel at one round. And this technique and his driving ended up winning him the race, and he ultimately catapulted himself into the top ranks of Grand Prix drivers in this era. And if you look at this photo, and just to sort of give you an idea of what it was like to drive these 1930 Grand Prix race cars, it was a very physically demanding experience. Rene, at the end of this race, you could barely see his hands here, but he couldn't even hold the trophy that he was given for the win because his hands were rubbed absolutely raw from the steering wheel. He was constantly shifting. The steering obviously was manual, and then he's adjusting oil valves and pressure and all the rest. And so it was a very trying experience, and again, a very physically demanding one. And I'd say, last but not least, it was an extremely dangerous sport at the time. These cars in the early 1930s had no safety harnesses. They did not wear helmets. There was no roll bars or anything like this. During this era of pre-war racing, it was not unheard of for one driver or several to die over the course of a weekend, whether in the time trials or in the race itself. And so Rene, by 1930, 1931, is driving for the best teams. He's driving for Maserati, Alfa Romeo, Bugatti. And then two things essentially happen to him. The first is he gets into this terrible accident at a race in France. That really, as he described it, he was thrown from the car, he skipped across the pavement like a stone and landed on his back. He was in the hospital for several weeks, but rather remarkably was sort of unhurt permanently. So a couple bruised bones, bruised ribs, some cuts, but made it out. The second thing that happens to Rene during the early 1930s is the rise of anti-Semitism. Even though he did not even consider himself Jewish, he of course had the Dreyfus last name, and if you know much about Colonel Dreyfus and the scandal in France in an earlier period, Dreyfus was probably the most recognizable Jewish name in Europe at this time. And even though Rene was not even distantly related to Colonel Dreyfus, he carried the name, and so he was considered Jewish. And with the rise of anti-Semitism in Italy, and particularly in Germany, Rene found himself kicked off the best teams. And by 1934, really, I guess the best way to describe it is he was kind of a jockey without a horse. He has no car to race, no team to race for. Now that leads me to the sort of, to simplify things, the kind of antagonist of this story, and that is Rudy Caracciola. Rudy was German, born into a wealthy family that owned hotels in Germany. He was probably, the best way of saying it is, a rascal of the highest order. He stole cars as a kid, boats, hijacked the elevator in his parents' hotel to ride guests up and down as fast as possible. Very similar to Rene, his love and his passion was speed and going fast and driving. And so ultimately, using family connections and the like, he finds himself working for the Mercedes company in Germany, first as a salesman, and then convincing his bosses time and time again, let me drive in one of your cars, let me race. Ultimately, in 1926, they allow him to participate in the German Grand Prix. He wins it in an absolute downpour and becomes what was called the Rainmaster. And so if conditions were poor, Rudy Caracciola would almost always sweep the field. He very quickly, very similar to Rene, catapulted in the top ranks of Grand Prix drivers, was the best driver in all of Germany, probably the number one or number two driver in Europe, next to Tazio Nuvolari, the Italian, the flying Mantuan, as he was described. And so Rudy, very similar to Rene, is living in this echelon of top drivers. They are traveling together, they're racing on weekends, their wives are friends, they live this very celebrity, rich life, but they're friends and they're companions on these trips. And they were very close. All these tight-knit group of drivers, probably 12 to 15 of them in Europe at the time, are very close. So two things happen similarly, echoing Rene to Rudy. The first is, like Rene, he gets into an awful crash. His was at the 1933 Monaco Grand Prix. He smashed into a wall. He absolutely just destroyed his right leg and his right hip. He had emergency surgery. They had to cut part of his, reduce the size of his leg. Unlike Rene, he was permanently hobbled from this. The doctors said, you will never drive again. He convalesced in a hospital and in a treatment center for almost a year of crippling pain, and could not walk without a cane once he emerged from the hospital. The second thing that happens to Rudy is that the love of his life, Charlie, while they were in Switzerland and he's recovering, she goes out one afternoon to go skiing because she'd been taking care of Rudy forever, and he's finally like, yes, go skiing with your friends. She's killed in an avalanche. And Rudy, by 1934, 1935, similar to Rene, again, is crushed and is sort of hopeless, aimless, and looking for a way to get back into the game, to drive again, because that's the only thing that mattered to him. Fortunately for Rudy, Adolf Hitler comes onto the scene, and when he rose to chancellor in 1933, rose to power. The second speech he ever gave was, once becoming chancellor of Germany, was at the Berlin Motor Show. And he makes a really large splash there, and he announces in a big speech that he's going to do four things. He's going to slash taxes on German automobiles to aid the development of the industry. He's going to align the technology and growth of that with aviation, so mixing car engines, aviation, or plane engines, and the development of both of those industries for Germany. He's going to build the national highway, what we now know as the Autobahn. And fourth, but by no means least, he announces that Germany is going to dominate international motorsport, the Grand Prix, which was the biggest sport in Europe at the time, bigger than soccer, bigger than everything. There were whole newspapers devoted to the Grand Prix. The best journalists wrote about it. Hundreds of thousands of people attended each race every weekend. And so it would be a huge propaganda win for the Germans and the greatness of Germany if they could dominate the Grand Prix. And so what happens is that an immense amount of funding is poured into Mercedes as well as Auto Union. And Auto Union is the predecessor of what we now know as Audi. And they develop what were called the Silver Eras, which are these cars you see in this image here. They were the most technologically advanced race cars ever built by a factor of almost two. They were extremely fast, they were very nimble, and very quickly, by 1934, when they first show up on the race scene, they absolutely dominate the field, leaving everyone behind, and the Germans are suddenly on top of the Grand Prix, undisputed. And as I said before, it just was propaganda after propaganda. And I'll just show you a picture. This is Rudy, to sort of take a step back. Once Hitler announces this, that he's going to be dominating racing, Rudy goes to Stuttgart, goes to the head of the company and says, I want to race again, I want to drive again, I don't care about my leg, I want this opportunity to drive these cars. And so despite being largely crippled, he gets into these race cars and suddenly, or very quickly, is at the top of the game again, and is the best driver in Europe because he's not only extremely talented, but he's driving the fastest cars. And so they have all this propaganda, not only in Germany, but throughout Europe and even the United States. These posters are everywhere announcing that the German drivers, this is a quote, are swift as greyhounds, tough as leather, strong as Krupp steel. So that leads me to Lucy Shep, who is probably one of my favorite people I've ever written about in the course of my many books. Lucy was born into a very wealthy American French family. Her father made his fortune actually out in Pennsylvania in factories. Once he was rich enough, he sold his firm. He traveled through Europe for several years, met a woman outside of Paris, and Lucy was their first and only child. Lucy grew up sort of the apple of her father's eye, was given whatever she wanted, and she could have very easily lived this sort of spoiled debutante life, but Lucy was an absolute doer. She dominated every room she was in, and she wanted a life of action and adventure and new experiences. During World War I, she became a nurse in Paris and tended and cared for a lot of French soldiers who were wounded on the line. And that experience was a pretty big one for her. She developed a strong antipathy towards the Germans and towards their war machine. And that is something that will play out as I move forward with the story. Lucy lived in Paris during the 20s, lived this sort of movable Hemingway-esque feast, and then ultimately married a man named Laurie Schell. Laurie was an avid race car driver, and Lucy caught the bug from the get-go. And so she becomes one of the earliest speed queens, one of the earliest female race car drivers. She battled a lot of sexism to be a part of that. And she was particularly good at rally driving. These races, in particular the Monte Carlo rally, which, you start off, thousands of miles away and you drive for 4 days straight and you end up in Monaco. They were races that required sort of toughness, daring, and as one reporter described, people looking for trouble. And so they'd have to fix their own cars. Sometimes they were attacked by boars, there were crashes, roads were washed away, there were blizzards. And Lucy was just an absolute courageous, tough driver. She was known to win several races with a broken arm at one point, and the faster or the more difficult things became, as one journalist described, who was actually in the car in the 1933 Monte Carlo rally, the more dangerous things got, the sort of bigger the smile was on Lucy's face. She and her husband, Laurie, became the top-ranked Americans driving the Monte Carlo rally and others in Europe at this time. They never won, but they came second place once. They won many prizes for that, and it became, Lucy in particular, again, became one of the most noted female rally drivers in the world. What happens, though, is by 1935, Lucy's kind of aging out of racing, but doesn't want to abandon it. And so she begins to start a rally team to fund cars for these rallies. And then soon after that, she gets this bigger ambition. And that harks back to what's happening with the Silver Arrows and what's happening, her experience about the Germans and her feelings towards them. As I mentioned, the Silver Arrows are winning left, right, and center all the time. They're this big propaganda machine for that. And of course, at this time in 1935, 1936, German aggression in Europe is becoming very plain and very obvious. And so Lucy wants to fight back against that. She wants to resist that. And neither the French nor the Italians or the Brits or anybody else is fielding cars to beat the Silver Arrows. And so she, on basically a very determined whim, decides that I'm going to be the one to take on the Nazis. And so she manages her own Grand Prix race team, the first woman to ever do so. She exhausts about half of her wealth to fund this team and fund this car that she wants developed, all to take on the Germans. So what she does first is she needs a car, and she goes to the Delahaye Auto Company for that in 1936. Now, Delahaye was really known, and the reason I have this photograph here is because they were really known for building trucks and truck engines. And mail trucks and fire trucks and transport trucks. They were not known for their cars. Their cars, as one critic said, were best driven in funeral processions. They were slow, they were clunky, and they weren't terribly attractive to look at. But what Delahaye did have was this very smart, very creative young engineer that just started in the firm named Jean-Francois. And she goes to Jean-Francois and the head of the firm and says, listen, I want you to build me a race car. I want you to take your genius and develop for me a Grand Prix car. And so that is exactly what Delahaye does. They're given a ton of funds from Lucy, and over the course of roughly 7 to 8 months, they develop what's called, as I mentioned earlier, the Delahaye 145 Grand Prix race car, which had a 12-cylinder engine. And as Rene Dreyfuss said, who you can see here in this car, sort of getting ahead of myself, he called it the ugliest little car I've ever seen in my life. But it was a very tough car. It had this, as Rene said, a son of a truck engine in it. It was very sturdy, and because of its size and Jean-Francois's genius, it was a very agile car. It did not have anywhere near the horsepower or the technological developments of the Silver Heiress, but it had shot. And so that is exactly what begins in this sort of journey of Delahaye and Lucy to develop and take on the Germans. But what she needs after a car, of course, is a driver. And you can't recruit Rudy Caracciola, and you can't recruit the flying Mantua and Tazio Nuvolari. Really, the best driver out there without a team was Rene because of his Jewish heritage. And so Lucy goes to Rene, invites him to lead her team. Rene is initially very reluctant. Again, this is a new team, a new car by this Delahaye company, and a woman is running this whole affair. And he just doesn't believe that any of those three things are going to work. But Lucy convinces him. She was an absolute fireball, and convinces him to race for them. And over the course of the next year, as they develop the car and as Rene trains to race it, Lucy really instills in Rene something that he never had before in it, which is critical to this story. Rene was always driving for himself. He was always driving for either the money or the fame or just the pure thrill of winning. But he never had a sort of larger purpose beyond himself. And Lucy sort of over time sort of convinced him that he could stand in really as a symbol for the Jewish people taking on the Nazis in this arena that was so important to them, that he could be, as one person eventually called Rene, the divine avenger, a symbol for the Jewish people. And so over the course of the story that I tell in Faster, this is that development. The Delahaye 145 car becomes the fastest car in France, beats every other comer in France. This shot here is Jean-Francois is the gentleman facing the picture, the gentleman to the right with the mustache and the dark hair. In the middle is Rene's wife, Shushu. And on the left, far left, is with the hat is Monsieur Charles, which was the head of the Delahaye firm. Ultimately, in 1938, at the opening of the 1938 Grand Prix season, the final confrontation between Mercedes and the Silver Arrows, Rudy and Rene and the Delahaye company happens. It's this enormous race in the south of France. No one thought that the Delahaye company or anyone would have a shot to beat the Germans, and it's the story climaxes this incredible race. I don't think I'm giving away too much to say that Rene won it. I'm not sure I've written the book if he would not have. And this is a terrific shot of Rene winning that race, and Lucy being involved in it. And it's, again, the story of resistance, of taking the fight in the community that you're in. And it's just probably one of the greatest unheard sports stories that I've ever found. And it was just an absolute pleasure and joy to write and research, and probably more than anything, sort of restoring or highlighting who Lucy Schell was, because I'm not sure if there's anyone here listening who's a sports or Grand Prix aficionado, But even the best of those would probably rarely have heard of Lucy Shell. She sort of largely disappeared from history after the war, and sort of restoring her place, incredible. The first woman to ever run and own her own Grand Prix team, and one of the earliest speed queens, and this tremendous impact she had on this pre-war story. So that's the highlights. I'd love to answer questions for everyone. I feel like this is the thing with these Zoom calls. You feel like you're talking into a vacuum a little bit. So I'd love to answer questions that you have, or talk about the writing it, or anything you'd like to ask, or some of my other books.
Thank you, Neil. That was great. When looking at your book, it's always sort of amazed me for a regime that was in power for 12 years, just how the tentacles of Nazism took over every aspect of Germany. And part of it, what you talked about was how Hitler himself was invested in making sure that the Mercedes-Benz, that the German drivers remained, it was a good propaganda thing, that Germans were winning this stuff. And am I wrong? Were you surprised by how encompassing this was? That the Nazis had taken over racing? I mean, it's
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty. I will say, it made a lot of sense to me. The propaganda end of it was not necessarily. I would not say it was surprising to me. Like, in some ways, this echoes a lot of the 1936 Olympics, and the sort of the Jesse Owens stories, and what an impact that was when the Germans thought that they would sort of sweep the gold rankings and everything. So this sort of intersection of sport and propaganda was something that I knew about, and I didn't know about it in racing, but it echoed that. What was so interesting to me beyond that, though, that did surprise me, and I haven't talked about, was that racing was more than just propaganda. And from the very start, when Hitler had his the Third Reich invest in the coffers of Mercedes and develop this propaganda and highlight who Rudi Kirchhoff was, it had a much more sinister purpose behind it, beyond just showing the greatness of Germany. And that was basically two things. The first was developing technology, developing these superpowered engines, and the aerodynamics of these cars, that was immediately transferable to the aviation industry, and supplying the technology transfer for the development of the Luftwaffe and their fighter planes. Second, the propaganda's purpose, beyond showing the greatness of the Reich, Hitler had started this paramilitary organization that was essentially to recruit young men to learn how to drive, and drive trucks, drive cars, and maintain them. Their mechanics and all the rest. And this paramilitary organization was to serve as the basis for Hitler's motorized infantry. And so literally hundreds of thousands of young men, inspired by the likes of Rudi Caricciolo, inspired by the likes of the Silver Arrows, joined this paramilitary organization. And as soon as Germany went on a war footing, these same individuals were the ones driving the trucks, driving the tanks, and servicing them for the Blitzkrieg operations that were ultimately so successful in the Nazi dominance, early dominance of Europe during World War II. So, that to me was absolutely amazing, and something that was surprising.
You touched on the fact that you're talking about someone that, even though he's not a practicing Jew or even fully Jewish, somebody named Rene Dreyfus. Is he haunted by his last name, even though he's not related? I mean, obviously, does this work against him, and being named Dreyfus? And um, how does Hitler react to a guy named Dreyfus defeating his driver? How does Rene react to a guy named Dreyfus defeating Hitler's driver?
Yeah, I mean it was definitely a major factor of the story. I mean, listen, he not only when before he was sort of kicked off of he was Rene was probably the fifth or sixth best driver in Europe by 1934, 1935. He's driving for Alfa Romeo, and he has a very successful season and is ready to come back and drive for them, and they kick him off the team. And they very clearly kicked him off the team because he was Jewish. In fact, the head of the Mercedes, the team manager for the Mercedes race team, wanted to recruit Rene, believe it or not, because he was so good. But it was sort of a non-starter for various obvious reasons, right? He was Jewish, and so you could not hire a Jewish driver to represent Germany, no matter how good he was. And there was the statement that Neubauer, the head of the team, said, well, Hitler will decide who's Jewish or not. But it was clear that that was not going to happen. So you do find that Rene, again, was kicked off of these teams, is no longer able to race for these top teams anymore. Not to mention the fact that even when he went back, in this period before he's kicked off, he's facing a lot of slurs and signs and catcalls at these races, anti-Semitic calls. Similarly, once he's back in the arena with Delahaye, he faces that. And then this race in Po, or this sort of culminating race in 1938, he is Rudy Caracciola. At a certain point, Rene is just absolutely cleaning the course with him. Rudy Caracciola stops, goes to the pits, and refuses to finish the race, and has the second best German driver take over the car because he doesn't want to face losing to Rene and to a Dreyfus, to a Jew. Subsequent to the race, it was an absolute embarrassment to the Germans, evidenced by the fact that when they invaded Paris, they went to the Automobile Club, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and literally hauled away every record of that win and had it destroyed. And there are no sort of official documents of that race anywhere except for the German archives, believe it or not.
What was Hitler's reaction when Rene?
It's unclear that there's no evidence of Hitler smashing a vase or anything like that. But I imagine it was not favorable, and by virtue of the fact that they sent men to find these cars and have them destroyed, and to have Rene arrested, all of which they were unsuccessful doing, is evidence that they did not enjoy the fact that they had been beaten.
I suppose the short answer is probably yes, but does Lucy feel vindicated that she's invested so much money and ultimately there is a victory? I mean, obviously time will tell, it's short-lived, but what's Lucy's reaction to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, Lucy was absolutely thrilled, and it was this huge success. I mean, no French team, no Italian team had beaten the Germans like this, and it was a cascade of news subsequent to that. Remarkably, she got no credit for it, or unremarkably, she got no credit for it because she was a woman. And so all the success was attributed to Rene or the Delahaye team. When Rene read all of these reports and none of them mentioned Lucy, he he came out and made this statement like this would not have happened without Lucy and her role and as the leader of this team. They had this very good, close relationship. But at the end of the day, Lucy was one of those people who was never satisfied with where she was. And so it was okay. We won that. How are we going to win the next one? And at a certain point, Delhay is not giving us the fastest car, so let's go to Alfa Romeo. We'll get an even faster car. And so she was fighting this fight all the way until war broke out and racing came to an end.
As I was looking over your book, how do I put this? As we looking through the context of 2021, does Mercedes-Benz, does Audi, do other these companies that were financed and supported, the Silver Arrows by Nazi money? Is there any regrets or remorse on their part? Have they ever come out and said, that was then, this is now? What? And maybe I've just been reading too much about woke things. I don't know, but I think what's the, how does Mercedes and Audi, et cetera, go back? Have they ever commented on their role in the 30s? Or
Yeah, I mean, they've. How can I put this? For a long time, they did not. Right? There was no. There were decades went by. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, where very little was written about, spoken about of. And these automobile companies were not the only ones, of course, that contributed to the Third Reich. I mean, almost every industry did. They were intimately interconnected, supporting the regime and all the rest. In the 80s and 90s, there were studies done by these companies saying, okay, this was the role that we played, and we did support the race industry, and some of our factories used slave labor. But again, it was, they had historians come in. It all had the feeling of a whitewash in a way. I mean, there was this sort of like taking responsibility, but cushioning it. I don't think there's ever been a sort of like tremendous mea culpa by either Mercedes or Auto Union, and they're very. How can I say this? They're very careful with their reputation and the exposure of their involvement. Even their archives are rigorously attended to, and you won't find something they don't want you to find.
I first became aware of a writer named Neil Bascomb when he wrote a book titled Hunting Eichmann. And I found it fascinating. I've always found that story to be unbelievable. And I know we're talking about Faster tonight, but it's a book you also wrote. Tell people about Hunting Eichmann. How long did it take you to research that? I've always found that story amazing. So tell people about that one.
Well, I appreciate the nice words. So Hunting Eichmann was the fourth book I wrote, and it's the story of Adolf Eichmann, who was probably the best way of saying it was the operational master of the Holocaust. He escaped to Argentina in the late 40s and was largely free, and no one was looking for him. And then the Mossad gets word or a tip that Eichmann may be living in Buenos Aires. And the story of Hunting Eichmann is the story of that mission about this young spy agency, the Mossad, which really was this small, understaffed, not terribly professional the spy agency at that period of time, not the Mossad we know of now. And they're sort of marshaling forces to send a team to capture Eichmann and bring him back to Israel and put him on trial. And it's this, as I was saying in the beginning, it's about asking myself questions like, what is, what's the story? The importance does it have to say? And this is a story about sort of justice and the importance of pursuing it, no matter what length of time. And the echoes of that capture of Eichmann are so positive in our understanding of the Holocaust and memory and justice and pursuit of modern war criminals, that it's this really, sort of Hollywood spy story that had this incredible influence on history afterwards. That book took me almost 4 years to write because the Mossad are not, you can't find them in the phone book. And and they're reluctant to talk to American journalists, but eventually they opened up to me, and I was the first journalist to sort of reveal the sort of full nature of that operation and El Al and the rest.
What's your next project?
So I'm writing something very different, as I always do. I'm writing about Gandhi's Salt March in India in 1930, which is his first major nonviolent movement in India against the British Raj. It's the story of this long march to the seashore, marshaling the forces of nonviolence and ultimately the sort of first shake of the British Empire. And it's the story of Gandhi and his son.
I want to thank you for taking the time for joining us tonight. This has been great.
Thank you, Mark.
I greatly enjoyed this. The name of the book is Faster. His name is Neil Bascomb. Hope you can navigate these last days of COVID. I do hope it's the last days of COVID, and continued success with this book.
Thank you, Mark, for the opportunity, and thank you, everyone, for listening.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.